Hello everyone, I'm Don Moyer from Moyer Marine. Our assignment in this video is to replace the rear oil seal in this late model Atomic 4 engine. The oil seal is a typical lip seal which is pressed into the center of this cast iron flange in the very back of the engine. The lip of the seal rides on the race on the inside of the output coupling just out of your view when the coupling is installed on the engine. We didn't get very far in setting up for this video before observing that the rear retaining nut, just on the outside of the output coupling, was very loose. Not surprisingly, you can feel that the output coupling also has developed play between it and the end of the tail shaft. Not a good situation. We won't know the extent of the damage to that keyway until we get better access later in this assembly. With the coupling so loose on the tail shaft, oil is free to move through the keyway slot into the space between the output coupling and the front face of the propeller shaft coupling. Those are both metal-to-metal mating surfaces, so the oil will frequently be flung out by the rotation of the engine and make a fine oily line around the inside of the engine compartment. A dead giveaway that you probably have a loose output coupling on the tail shaft, and you should look into it without delay. In terms of new parts that you will likely need to effect this repair, you will certainly need a new oil seal. If the output coupling is very loose on the shaft, you will need a new output coupling and keyway. The gaskets include these two round gaskets for the rear flanges and this cork gasket that goes under the access plate in the aft housing. We're including a couple of bolts here which we'll explain during the video. This is a pair of 5/16 inch coarse threaded bolts, about 5 inches long, 4 to 5. And these three grade 8, 3/8 inch fine threaded bolts. These are available at most any well-equipped local hardware store. The only hand tool you may not have in your toolbox already is this large 1 1/8" socket shown here at the end of a 1/2 inch drive breaker bar. And these three specialty tools, which we use in our shop to facilitate this work. It includes the puller for the output coupling and this really unique seating device for the output coupling, and this tool which we use to retain the output coupling while we break this large nut loose in the back. The first step in disassembly is to fold back the locking tabs on this flat washer and then remove the big 1 1/8" retaining nut. Now, if this nut were not loose, it would almost assuredly require the use of a 1 1/8" socket and breaker bar, which means we have to have some way of holding this output coupling from turning. The best way to do that, particularly in the confines of the most boats, is to use one of our output coupling retaining tools. You simply attach it by putting in these shortened 3/8 inch fine threaded bolts. You don't have to usually even tighten them very hard. A little more than I'm doing here for this loose coupling would be ideal. And then that will give you plenty of leverage, even in very restricted areas if you're doing this work as you might be on your boat. Then we take the socket and breaker bar, and we can really apply a lot of muscle to get that nut loose. If you don't have this retaining tool and can beg, borrow, or steal an 18-inch pipe wrench, the jaws on an 18-inch pipe wrench will just barely clear the OD of the output coupling. So with the nut removed, we are ready then to pull the coupling off of the tail shaft. And again, if the output coupling were not loose, that could be a very difficult job. I suggest first trying to make it move back using these hardware store a little bit longer than your original coupling bolts. And by turning them all the way through the coupling, the front of the bolts will contact the face of that cast iron oil seal plate. And as you continue to tighten those bolts, they will have the effect of moving the coupling back. Now make sure that you tighten them very evenly, going round and round in each case. And the harder it comes, the more careful you want to be to keep exerting a nice even pressure. And as the coupling comes further and further back, it should come off more easily as you go, and eventually it will yield. If you don't have, or if in cases where the coupling is simply not yielding to this quick fix, you'll have to get one of our output coupling pulling tools and apply some more muscle. It also attaches to the 3 threaded holes in the coupling. You'll want to be sure to put the bolt all the way through for maximum pulling power. The initial pulling power, after you have the retaining bolts evenly threaded on, is to tighten this center post using a 3/4 inch socket or box end wrench. Even in this case, if the coupling is simply not yielding, and now and then we have those worst cases coming our way, you can apply a little more torque by then retightening these bolts, because they're finer threads. A little more torque is transferred to the apparatus, and that will, in most cases, get the coupling to yield. And eventually off it comes. With the coupling removed, we're now ready to move ahead and remove the 6 retaining bolts of these oil seal and rear main thrust bearing removal. We are next removing the 6 retaining bolts which hold the rear flanges in place. Notice that the lower 3 bolts have brass flat washers, because otherwise they will tend to have oil seeping out past between the threads and the heads of the bolt. The oil seal flange itself, which is the first flange we'll come to here, comes off very easily. The rear thrust bearing flange will sometimes need a little more encouragement. Now, if we were only changing the rear oil seal, we could leave the bearing plate in place. But in this case, we'll need to remove it as well as the oil seal flange so we can have better access to examine the tail shaft for any damage. We'll also be removing the access cover for the same reason, to give us a little better access in examining the tail shaft of the reversing gear. These bolts, we also prefer to have brass flat washers on to eliminate any tendency for oil to be splashing up between the bolt and the head of the bolt, which sometimes happens if you use lock washers. We can now see clearly both inside and outside of the tail shaft once we remove the thrust bearing plate. And there it's coming without too much of a fight. Again, if we were just replacing the rear oil seal, we would not have to be removing this back plate. And there we can see the big, robust rear thrust bearing so dependably in the Atomic 4. With the rear bearing flange and access plate removed, we have good access to examine the tail shaft and output coupling fit. There are two important considerations in this regard. The output coupling should have what machinists call a soft press fit over the tail shaft. As we can see, this output coupling, it is totally free spinning on the tail shaft. Not a good thing at all. When we fit the new coupling on this tail shaft, it goes on with a lot tougher fit than the old one did, which would get us in the ballpark of being satisfactory. The second consideration is the keyways. If we look closely at the old keyway, we can easily see, when compared to a new one, that there is a considerable galling on the inside of the keyway, which I fully suspect accounts for most of the side-to-side play that we saw before we started the disassembly. It's fairly common to see this because keyways by design tend to be a little softer than the shaft and the coupling that they're there to protect. So with a new keyway installed in a new coupling, we should see the side-to-side clearance disappear totally between this new coupling and the old tail shaft. So fortunately, this condition was discovered in time before the tail shaft became unusable. Otherwise, we'd be replacing the whole reversing gear instead of just the rear oil seal. The next step in the reassembly process is to replace the old oil seal with the new one. This doesn't present much of a problem usually. The orifice of the plate is flat, straight through, so you can drive the seal in or out from either side. We'll just lay it between these 2x4s and then take a large socket, if you happen to have one, or a piece of pipe. This one happens to come from one of our water pump repair kits. And we'll just simply drive it out of the housing. Like so. Again, you can see that the inner edge of that orifice is perfectly flat. There's no lip on it. In other words, that you have to drive the seal in from one side or the other. The important part is, however, to have the lip of the seal facing the inside of the engine to keep the oil from coming out from the engine. So we will have to have the lip facing in as we drive the new seal onto the or into the rear flange. A medium-sized ball peen hammer will normally do a good job of that, and we just drive it in until it's flush with the outside of the plate, like so, and then the plate is ready for reinstallation. Reinstalling the rear thrust bearing flange and oil seal flange, the gaskets, and the output coupling can be a bit tricky unless you got them in the proper sequence and lined up correctly. To help in that process, I used 2 long bolts, which we mentioned previously. I put them through opposite corners on the thrust bearing flange, making sure that the sealed part of the thrust bearing and this reinforcing rib goes in towards the crankshaft, towards the crankcase. Then we can put a gasket next, and then we'll just start these bolts into the aft housing to keep things lined up for us. As we apply a thin layer of Permatex on the rear face of the aft housing. It doesn't take much of this very tenacious old friend of most of us. We've had this since I've been a teenager. It's one of the most tenacious sealers that we know of. After we have it on the aft housing, we can move the gasket front a bit and then put a thin layer on the front face of the bearing plate. After we have a nice thin even layer, we can easily then slide the plate front into a location and gently tap it into the ID of the aft housings till it's nice and flat. Once it's solidly in place, we can then remove these bolts and repeat that very process to get the gasket properly positioned between the oil seal housing and the bearing plate. There's an extra hole in these gaskets for some reason or other. I'm not sure. It must be for some other engine series, which you have to be a little careful getting the right pair. And then we once again start the long bolts into the housing, and that helps us to keep the gasket lined up with the holes as we once again put a thin layer of Permatex on the rear face of the bearing plate. And the front face of the oil seal flange. Doesn't take very much of this good sealer. And then that flange can go into location and be held securely by the bolts. Now we can take the output coupling and position the key in alignment with the tail shaft keyway and start the coupling in place. It's with the new coupling, it's going a little bit harder, but a very nice press fit, and we would type that in like so until we get to where the threads can be picked up by the big retaining nut, and then we can tighten it and drive the coupling front the rest of the way. However, before you reach for a bigger and bigger hammer, you might want to consider the way we do it in the shop, because the only thing preventing that tail shaft from being driven front into the back of the crankshaft is that little rather fragile in front of the tail shaft, and that responds much more safely to a nice pressing fit than a pounding one. And so with this tool, we can easily continue moving that output coupling forward to its final resting place. Now, as that turns harder and harder, it's critically important that you take a flashlight and look into the access opening, and you can actually see that the front leading edge of the coupling is actually in contact with that special bevel spacer that between the front of the coupling and the stop ring on the tail shaft, and you can actually see those two surfaces meeting. The danger is that the keyway will sometimes get ahead of the coupling, and when that happens, it will wedge against between the coupling and the bevel spacer, and the coupling won't be able to go on the whole way. Now, this new coupling had only a modest pressed fit, so I used my bare hands when tightening the installer tool. If your coupling gives you more resistance, you'll probably need a wrench to seat the coupling far enough to safely start the big retaining nut. We can now remove these things and get ready to put the rest of the bolts into the flanges. There are no torque values for these 6 retaining bolts. You simply tighten them as hard as you can easily with a 3/8 inch ratchet, which we find. And the final step in the assembly is to reinstall the big nut. And I always like to put the nut on and tighten it first without the washer, and in that way we don't risk damaging the retaining washer during the initial tightening process. And large breaker bar. Now, whether you end up tapping the coupling onto the tail shaft using a small mallet or using one of our coupling installing tools, the final seating of the coupling is usually accomplished by tightening the big retaining nut. There is no torque value established for the large retaining nut. I don't believe that it's really possible to over-tighten the retaining nut. I never heard of any such problem. When the coupling is fully in place, and the final act then is to install a new locking tab washer, making sure that the indexing tab is in the keyway of the tail shaft. And then back on goes the nut for the final tightening process. And again, I don't think it's possible to over tighten these rear nuts. except for bending over a couple ears on that tab washer, we're pretty much at the end of our assignment. Most any common screwdriver can be used to get those retaining ears started down. We have used this screwdriver for years for these kinds of things by just putting a little bit of a sharper edge on it for ease of prying the housings off and for things like the tab washers. And there is our new oil seal, and absolutely no play in that output coupling. So we should be good for many more years of service on there after we placing the access cover. Many people ask us whether you need to drain the oil before you would replace an oil seal, and the answer is no, you don't. Even with the engine tilted in a normal tilt on virtually all sailboats, the oil pool doesn't come above the rear seal with the engine not running, of course. So as long as you keep the oil level at or below the full mark, you'll be fine. It's important to back up and point out here that had we been able to use the original output coupling, this seating surface here where the oil seal will ride would have very quickly torn up and destroyed the new oil seal. What we do to prevent that is to install a speedy sleeve. They come with different names: repair sleeve, speedy sleeve. They're all basically the same product. Each kit, each sleeve includes this installing tool. You simply drive the sleeve down over this part where the oil seal rides. We like to put a little fine layer of Permatex around the coupling first, and then we simply drive the the sleeve until it becomes literally part of the output coupling. In that way, the new seal will think that it's being installed over a brand new output coupling. We need to make a very critical observation at this point. Given the extreme difficulty that most of you would face if you ever had to change a rear oil seal on board your boat, given the poor access and the working conditions and the rusty coupling bolt and all of that, you want to make very sure that what you think is a rear oil seal leak really is. The point here being that unless you see an oil stream emanating from right below the coupling and dripping down over this lower bolt, you probably don't have a leaky rear seal. Given the slant of the engine in almost all sailboats, any number of other places can create an oil leak, and because the engine does slant, a drip from the water pump or from a leaky water pump flange gasket or bolt, or a leaky flange gasket on the accessory drive, all of those oil leaks will end up on the upper ledge of the oil pan, and they'll find their way back because of the slant again, and they'll appear on the back end of your engine, giving you the sometimes false impression that you have a rear seal leaking. There's even more spots on the carburetor side of the engine that oil leaks can easily generate. For example, the gasket around the valve cover is a good source of oil leaks. The flange gaskets on the fuel pump. Not to mention there's two pressure ports on this side for the sending unit for your pressure gauge in the cockpit, and an oil safety switch. All of those things can create oil drippage, which again on that side of the engine will come to the ledge above the oil pan, and find their way back here again to make you think you have a real seal leak when you don't really have one. So again, however difficult it is for you to get a mirror and flashlight for a look right directly under your output coupling for that stream of oil, however hard that is, it's a lot easier than changing a seal if you don't have to. We sometimes feel a bit guilty thinking that we might make this work seem a lot easier than it really is here in the air-conditioned shop on a clean workbench. But hopefully some of the techniques we've shared with you in the process will come in handy if you have to make this repair in the back of your hot, small engine compartment. Anyway, these parts and tools can be found on our website at moyermarine.com. Thank you very much for your attention and time today.